broken its silence. After U.S. forces captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, Beijing is issuing an ultimatum to Washington, and the stakes extend far beyond diplomacy. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has condemned the U.S. operation as a clear violation of international law and issued 4 explicit demands to the Trump administration. But behind China's diplomatic protest lies a far bigger concern. More than $100 billion in investments, loans, oil deals, and strategic influence that Beijing has spent 2 decades building in Venezuela. Is China the biggest geopolitical loser in the US-Venezuela showdown? What happens to Beijing's massive investments in Caracas? What about the loans, the energy projects, the strategic foothold China cultivated in Latin America? Venezuela is no longer just a regional crisis. It has triggered a global power confrontation, and China is sounding the alarm. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has issued 4 explicit demands to Washington. First, guarantee the personal safety of President Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores. Second, immediately release President Maduro and his wife. Third, stop efforts to overthrow Venezuela's government. Fourth, resolve disputes through dialogue and negotiation. These are not suggestions. Beijing framed them as demands, a rare level of directness from Chinese diplomacy. The Foreign Ministry called the U.S. strike a clear violation of international law and the basic norms of international relations, as well as the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter. Beijing described the development as deeply troubling. China says it is deeply shocked by Maduro's capture. In a sharply worded statement, the Chinese Foreign Ministry condemned the U.S. military strike on Venezuela and the capture of its president. The actions of the United States clearly violate international law and the basic norms of international relations, the ministry stated. Beijing accused Washington of hegemonic behavior and warned that the move threatens peace and security across Latin America and the Caribbean. China said it firmly opposes the use of force against a sovereign state and rejects any justification offered by the United States. Chinese state media did not hold back. China's state-run Xinhua news agency published an editorial saying the U.S. operation once again lays bare Washington's reliance on unilateral force to shape outcomes beyond its borders. The editorial continued, "This aggression also hollows out decades of U.S. rhetoric positioning America as the guardian of international rules." By bypassing the United Nations Security Council, Washington has again acted in direct opposition to the tenets of international law. The Global Times, a nationalist tabloid that focuses on foreign affairs, noted that the abruptness and unprecedented nature of the arrest of another country's leader in the post-Cold War era caught global media, experts, and political figures by surprise. Chinese military experts told the Global Times that the operation demonstrated American electronic warfare capabilities and the effectiveness of Delta Force special operations. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Asked about the meeting between Maduro and Chinese officials just hours before his capture, Trump told Fox and Friends on Saturday morning, "I have a very good relationship with Xi, and there's not going to be a problem. They're going to get oil." Trump also stated, "We'll be selling large amounts of oil to other countries. We're in the oil business. We're going to sell it to them." For Beijing, this is a complicated message. On one hand, Trump appears to be signaling that Chinese oil supplies will not be cut off. On the other hand, the implication is clear. Washington will now control who gets Venezuelan oil, and on what terms. That represents a fundamental shift in the balance of power. The scale of Chinese investment in Venezuela is staggering. Over the past 2 decades, China has poured more than $100 billion into Venezuela through loans, infrastructure projects, energy development, space cooperation, and strategic partnerships. This is not a small investment. It represents one of China's largest commitments in Latin America, and one of the biggest bets Beijing has made anywhere in the developing world. Venezuela currently owes approximately $15.6 billion in loans and other financial assistance to China. Billions more have flowed through joint ventures, technology transfers, and development projects. The investment covered virtually every sector of the Venezuelan economy. Chinese companies built housing. Chinese engineers worked on railways. Chinese technology powered telecommunications networks. The capture of Maduro puts all of these investments at risk. A critical question for Beijing: what happens to the money Venezuela owes? If Washington installs a new government in Caracas, will that government honor Venezuela's debts to China, or will it prioritize relationships with Western creditors and investors? There is precedent for concern. When governments change, new leaders sometimes challenge the legitimacy of debts incurred by their predecessors. For Beijing, this is not just about Maduro. It's about whether 2 decades of investment will be protected or lost. Venezuela became one of China's most important gateways into Latin America. Under former President Hugo Chavez, Caracas opened its doors to Beijing. China saw an opportunity to expand its influence in America's traditional sphere of influence. The relationship deepened over 2 decades. Chinese companies invested in Venezuelan oil fields. Chinese banks provided loans when Western institutions would not. Chinese technology flowed into Venezuelan infrastructure. Venezuela became a cornerstone of Beijing's long-term regional strategy, a foothold from which China could expand across Latin America and the Caribbean. China has been actively expanding its Latin American presence. In May 2025, Chinese President Xi Jinping pledged $9.2 billion in credit lines for CELAC, the community of Latin American and Caribbean states, as part of Beijing's efforts to compete with American influence in the region. Two-way trade between China and CELAC countries reached $515 billion in 2024, up from just $12 billion in 2000. Venezuela was central to that strategy. Caracas provided China with a friendly government, access to oil, and a platform for regional engagement. The loss of Maduro disrupts all of those plans. Now that foothold is threatened. The core dimension of China's interest in Venezuela is oil. Venezuela holds the world's largest proven oil reserves, approximately 303 billion barrels. Despite years of decline, the country currently produces around 1 million barrels per day, and most of that oil goes to China. According to Reuters, Venezuela's oil shipments to China averaged over 600,000 barrels per day in December 2025, constituting about 4% of China's total oil imports. Chinese state oil companies have invested billions in Venezuelan petroleum infrastructure. Venezuela repays Chinese loans partly through oil shipments. The energy relationship has been central to the bilateral partnership for years. Chinese state oil companies, CNPC and Sinopec, have both operated in Venezuela. They have invested in oil field development, signed production sharing agreements, and provided technical support. These investments were made under Maduro and his predecessor Chavez. They were protected by the Bolivarian government's friendly relationship with Beijing. Under a new government aligned with Washington, those protections may disappear. Chevron, the only major U.S. oil company currently operating in Venezuela, produces about 250,000 barrels per day, roughly a quarter of Venezuela's output. If other American companies return, Chinese companies may find themselves competing on unfavorable terms, or pushed out entirely. If Washington installs a new government in Caracas, what happens to those oil contracts? What happens to the arrangements that send Venezuelan crude to Chinese refineries? These questions are now urgent for Beijing. The timing of Maduro's capture adds another layer to the story. Hours before U.S. forces launched their operation, Maduro was meeting with China's special representative on Latin American affairs, Chu Xiaoqi. According to Chinese state media, Chu reiterated that China and Venezuela are long-standing strategic partners, and said Beijing was keen to strengthen ties and enhance coordination to jointly create a bright future for China-Venezuela relations. The meeting was also attended by Delcy Rodriguez, Venezuela's vice president, who has now become acting president since Maduro's forced removal. Then came the strikes. The fact that Maduro was engaged with Chinese diplomacy just hours before his capture will not be lost on Beijing. It may heighten Chinese concerns about American intentions. China is not alone in its condemnation. Russia responded swiftly and forcefully. In a rare early morning statement, Moscow accused the United States of committing armed aggression against Venezuela. The Russian Foreign Ministry rejected Washington's justification outright, calling it untenable. Moscow said ideological hostility has replaced diplomacy and warned that escalation could spiral beyond control. Russia has its own interests in Venezuela. Russian companies have invested in Venezuelan oil. Russian military equipment has been sold to Caracas. Russia has used Venezuela as a platform to project influence into Latin America. Dmitry Medvedev, deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council, went further than the foreign ministry. He argued that the events prove any country wishing to protect itself must strengthen its military to the maximum, and that only a nuclear arsenal can guarantee sovereignty. Medvedev closed his statement with words that generated immediate reaction. Long live nuclear weapons. Medvedev's logic is stark. International law did not protect Venezuela. The UN Charter did not protect Venezuela. Diplomacy did not protect Venezuela. Only military power, specifically nuclear weapons, can guarantee that a country's leader will not be captured and taken to a foreign court. Iran also launched a scathing attack on the US over its Venezuela operation. Tehran's foreign ministry issued a lengthy condemnation, calling the attack a clear breach of Venezuela's sovereignty and international law. Iran described the operation as a textbook example of a violation of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, which prohibits the use of force against the territorial integrity of any state. Tehran warned that such actions undermine global stability and set a dangerous precedent. Iran has its own reasons for concern. Tehran has faced American pressure for decades. The Venezuela operation may heighten Iranian fears about what Washington might do elsewhere. North Korea also condemned the capture of Maduro. Pyongyang's foreign ministry called the operation the most serious form of encroachment of sovereignty, according to state news agency KCNA. The incident is another example that clearly confirms once again the rogue and brutal nature of the United States, the statement said. Then, on Sunday morning, North Korea fired multiple ballistic missiles into the EC, its first missile launch of the year. Analysts said the timing was significant. Kim Jong-un may be unnerved by the demonstration of American willingness to capture a sitting head of state. For decades, Pyongyang has justified its nuclear program as protection against American regime change. The Venezuela operation may reinforce Kim's belief that nuclear weapons are essential for survival. From Beijing to Tehran to Moscow to Pyongyang, major powers are lining up against Washington's move. This alignment is significant. These powers do not always coordinate their foreign policies. They have different interests and different relationships with Washington. But on Venezuela, they are speaking with one voice: condemnation of American action and defense of sovereignty. The United Front suggests that the Venezuela operation is being viewed not as an isolated event, but as part of a broader pattern of American behavior that these powers oppose. For Washington, this creates a challenging diplomatic environment. The US may have captured Maduro, but it now faces coordinated opposition from 4 major powers. The United Nations Security Council is set to meet on Monday, at the request of Venezuela and Colombia, and with the support of permanent members Russia and China. The Council will convene to address what Venezuela's ambassador to the UN, Samuel Moncada, described as a colonial war aimed at destroying our republican form of government. China's ambassador to the UN, Fu Kong, had warned in December against American intervention, saying Beijing opposed all acts of unilateralism and bullying. Now Beijing is backing the call for an emergency meeting. Whether the Security Council can take meaningful action remains uncertain. The United States holds veto power. But the diplomatic symbolism is significant. Latin American reactions have been divided. Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva condemned the attack, saying the strikes crossed an unacceptable line and set a dangerous precedent. He said the action evoked the worst moments of interference in Latin America. Colombian President Gustavo Petro called for an urgent meeting of the Organization of American States and the United Nations. He deployed security forces along the border to prepare for a possible refugee influx. Mexico called the strikes a violation of the UN Charter and urged an immediate halt to acts of aggression. Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel condemned what he described as a criminal U.S. attack. But countries with right-wing governments, including Argentina and Ecuador, have largely welcomed Maduro's removal. The region is split. The Venezuela operation has sparked widespread discussion on Chinese social media. The topic shot to the top of China's Weibo platform, gaining some 440 million views, according to Bloomberg. Many commentators drew parallels between the fate of Venezuela and Taiwan, the self-ruled democracy that Beijing has vowed to claim. Some users suggested the operation offered a template for how Beijing could handle tensions with Taiwan. Others expressed concern about American willingness to use force. For Beijing, the social media reaction is a complication. It highlights public attention to the question of American power projection and raises expectations about Chinese responses. Trump's statements add to Chinese concerns. The president said the U.S. will oversee Venezuela for now and will seize the opportunity to repair Venezuelan oil infrastructure and export large quantities of crude. We're going to have our very large United States oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world, go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure, Trump said. We built Venezuela's oil industry with American talent, drive, and skill, and the socialist regime stole it from us, Trump added. Venezuela unilaterally seized and sold American oil, American assets, and American platforms, costing us billions and billions of dollars. For China, these words are alarming. They suggest Washington intends to reshape Venezuela's economy, potentially at China's expense. If American companies move into Venezuelan oil fields, will Chinese companies be displaced? If Washington controls Venezuelan oil policy, will exports to China continue? What can China actually do in response? Diplomatically, Beijing can condemn the operation, demand Maduro's release, and mobilize international opposition. It has already done this. Economically, China could impose costs on American interests. But the U.S.-China economic relationship is vast and complex. Major retaliation would hurt both sides. Militarily, China has no ability to project power into Latin America. As one analyst noted, China has only 2 military bases outside its borders, while America has 800. Beijing cannot physically intervene. This is China's dilemma. Significant interest at stake, but limited tools to protect them. Beijing can protest. It cannot reverse what has happened. One consequence may be closer China-Russia coordination. Both powers have condemned the Venezuela operation. Both have interests in resisting American unilateralism. Both may conclude that they need to work together more closely. The Venezuela crisis comes at a time when U.S.-China relations are already strained and Russia is under Western sanctions over Ukraine. If Beijing and Moscow conclude that Washington will act aggressively against their partners, they may strengthen their own partnership. They may coordinate more closely on opposing American actions globally. The Venezuela operation could accelerate the formation of a more coherent anti-American bloc. The Venezuela operation has historical significance. This is the first instance since the U.S. invasion of Panama in 1989, Operation Just Cause, where a sitting head of state was captured by U.S. forces on their own territory and transferred to a third country. In 1989, U.S. forces invaded Panama and captured